Thank you, Jeff. So are we ready to go? All right, so just a quick message to the panelists. I'll be controlling the slideshow. So when we get to the slides, you'll have to tell me when you want me to change it, okay? So speaking of slides, let me open my slideshow. And welcome everybody. It's really my honor to be a part of this panel and to be part of this conference. I think this is my third round in this conference, and it's always been a pleasure. So I thought what I would do, instead of introducing everyone at once at the beginning, that with the four panelists that are with us, I will introduce them as we, before each of them give a small presentation. So I just want to set up a little bit of what we're doing here when we talk about ecomedia literacy. And excuse me, some of you may know that I'm the author of a book called Ecomedia Literacy, and also recently co-edited an open source book, the Routledge Handbook of Ecomedia Studies. And I wanted to plug this because it's open access, and in particular has many chapters from Latin American authors and indigenous authors. So I would encourage you to try to find it at some point online for free. It's very good background information for many of the issues that we'll be discussing here. So I just want to start with a basic definition of ecomedia, because probably a lot of people are not familiar with when we say ecomedia, what do we mean? So as a starting point, it's a revised and expanded definition of media. So we're thinking about media beyond what historically maybe be limited to thinking of mass media or representations or TV, film, newspapers, things like that, to also include understanding media as coming from the environment, that it's is comprised of materials and it has impacts on the environment. And so when we talk about ecomedia, we're not just talking about the way we talk about media, but we're also exploring in what ways are our media technologies part of an extractive global economy, and also impacting the earth in ways such as when server farms have to use fossil fuels to power our data usage. So in terms of ecomedia literacy, it's at least the way that I'm defining it, and other people will certainly come along and find ways to think about it. It's pretty much a combination of the insights that critical media literacy allow us to have when we do media analysis with the ecomedia perspective. And I want to stress that it's both about creative and critical engagement. So it's not just criticizing and thinking about media, but also creative expression. And for example, I think what you'll see in this panel are a variety of examples that are quite diverse and quite interesting. Today, for example, you learn about AI, food marketing, colonial and anti-colonial discourses, climate disinformation, and public versus transportation discourses. This is a very small sample of what is possible when we talk about ecomedia literacy. Okay, so I'm going to finish talking here. And we'll start. Oh, last point. I just want to emphasize that at least the way that I approach this, and I think many of the panelists also, when they talk about ecomedia, we are approaching it from a eco-climate justice perspective, which is seeing that environmental and climate struggles are intersectional with social justice, class, race, gender, ableism, inequality, globalization, and et cetera. We don't separate these issues, we combine them. All right. So our first presenter is going to be Rachel Golden, and she's a PhD and assistant professor of communication at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. Her research interests include critical media literacy education and popular culture. She uses a critical cultural approach to understand media phenomena through the theoretical frameworks of critical theory, critical political economy of media, critical race theory, and she has designed and taught courses including ecomedia literacy in children and media. Golden's most recent research addresses news literacy, journalistic learning, and ecomedia literacy. And I'll just add that I've been following her on Twitter, but I've never actually met in person. So I'm happy to see Rachel here. So Rachel, you're on.
Thanks, Antonio. I appreciate that. I feel the same way. I've seen you in presentation, so it's nice to be able to be on a panel with you. So thank you, everyone. My name is Rachel Golden, and as Dr. Lopez said, I'm at Denison University. So today, the short remarks that I'll be sharing are really based off of my experience currently teaching a class that I've built based on the work of Dr. Lopez and his construction of Ecomedia Literacy. And the class that I'm teaching and thinking about what AI looks like in relationship to that. So if we can go to the next slide. So just for a little context, I teach at a small liberal arts university in the Midwest of the United States. And AI has become pretty predominant in the conversations that are occurring on campus. And I've noticed that the conversations exist primarily in two spaces, which I'm calling adjudicate or celebrate. And those conversations in the adjudicate department really focus on how AI is a problem to be punished in terms of intellectual property and work. So the focus is on plagiarism or beneficial tech or the ways in which students are bypassing thinking by using AI. The alternative to that is that AI is a beneficial technology. So it sort of swings, the conversation swings to the opposite side of the spectrum, that AI is a beneficial technology, and we have a critical discussion about how it's integrated into all aspects of education, little attention paid to ethics of the technology, the costs, or the implications. In fact, one colleague at my university was leading a session on AI and said it was just like a microwave. It's a neutral technology, and it really won't have any types of impacts on the world. It'll just make things easier. And if you are a media scholar like myself, your head just immediately exploded. So that's sort of the kind of conversation that I'm coming out of with my thoughts that I'll be sharing in this session. So if we can go to the next slide. Just to set some framework, so in this media literacy course where I've been thinking about this, I'm drawing on Antonio's work and using the Ecomedia Literacy framework, which for my 200 level students, I've reduced sort of down to the mind print and the footprint, which comes out of that Ecomedia Literacy text that Dr. Lopez has written. And when we think about mind print, we're thinking about symbolic representational impacts of media on our planetary conditions. And when we're thinking about footprint, we're thinking about the material physical impacts of media on our planetary conditions. So we're thinking both about text and technology, the extractive and the productive components of that. And so when I think about AI, I feel as though, or I believe as though there is a space between the adjudicate and celebrate conversation that is predominating the conversation as I see it. And I think that there are opportunities for us to think through the ecomedia framework and consider alternative ways to analyze, conceptualize, and integrate or challenge AI in educational spaces. So in the next slide, I'll just share some of the questions that I think this framework enables us to ask in those analyses. So the first is, how do generative AI chatbots respond to prompts about environment and about media? How do generative AI image generators respond to prompts about environment and about media? So thinking through that framework and thinking about representations, we can ask what kind of language is used, what perspectives, philosophies, worldviews, ideas, ideologies are embedded in these outputs. And conversely, how do outputs change when different language is used in the prompt? So we can get a sense and start to unpack the ideologies that are built into this structure. Similarly, when we're thinking about the images, what kind of images are generated when we ask about the environment? What perspectives, philosophies, worldviews are embedded in these? And how are those outputs changed when the inputs are changed? Next slide, please. In addition, I think it's worth considering the opportunities that we have when we think through that footprint a component of the framework? What are the material and physical implications? And so the material considerations include making sense of the physical demands of the technology on the planet. So how is AI powered? How is AI technology made? How does it run, and how does AI help and harm the planet at sort of the broad level? But the big questions can be reduced to sort of these smaller questions, or broken into smaller questions, like what kind of rare earth minerals are required to make computers run AI programs? Where do those energy sources come from? Where are server farms located that are housing this information? And what are the CO2 impacts on our planet where those server farms are located? How do those infect, that might have been a Freudian slip there. How do they affect the environment in those locations? And what are the energy demands of the AI programs? There are lots of really interesting inquiries in this space already, even from mainstream sites or mainstream news sources like the Washington Post, who's reported on the types of quote digital sweatshops that are needed to run AI data farms, as well as interesting commentary on sustainability from even mainstream sources like Forbes. So of course, once we move into a more critical space, we can dig into those a little bit further. And so ultimately, this concludes my little 5-minute section of our presentation. And so I think we'll move to the next slide. I conclude by suggesting that using an ecomedia literacy framework to examine generative AI systems extends the ethical conversation surrounding AI beyond simply academic integrity, and it lets the discussion move past whether AI is good or bad, but it complicates it, and it gives us a broader ethical understanding, not just for humans, but for the whole planet. So thank you for the time. I apologize for running over a few seconds there, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rachel. I think we have to talk about co-authoring an article, because I've been doing similar investigations, and I think we're on a parallel path here, so we need to talk. All right. So Michaela is our next presenter. Michaela Ensweiler is a former second grade teacher, ESL teacher, and manager, and project manager of a Fortune 500 company. She earned her BA in English Literature and Creative Writing and MS Ed in Education from Johns Hopkins University. She is a third-year PhD candidate in the School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research includes assessing human-food relationships, foodways, and food systems in order to disrupt dominant systems of food production and consumption, education, and move towards sustainable urban farming as an act of eco-pedagogy. I just realized that I was reading a bit fast, and I hope our interpreters are having a chance to catch up. So just a note to all of us to slow down a little bit on behalf of our interpreters. Okay, Michaela?
Cool. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here with such great scholarship. And thank you so much for the introduction. Like was stated, I'm a third-year PhD candidate at UCLA, and my research evolves around eco-pedagogy and foodways. So in this presentation particularly, I'm looking at how the systems of education and food became industrialized. This industrialization that I mostly like to look at began near the 40s through the 60s here in America, where the United States began to march to the beat, or this mantra of for the masses. So educate the masses, feed the masses. This messaging was for the masses as the US was starting to experience a baby boom. So if you could advance the slide just a second, cool. Okay, so the ad you see on my slide on the left-hand side has to do with the industrialization of a very particular foodway, the grocery store. So instead of having those mom and pop stores where the farmer who grew the food would sell it, grocery stores became lined with self-serve foods in cellophane packaging, lights, mirrors, colors, foods used to advertise different foods. These were things that were used to entice the consumer. So years later, food information is becoming increasingly enticing while also becoming somewhat disingenuous. So how many people here in this presentation have heard anything about the color of your food? Especially the color of the yolk of your egg, or the color of the fish that you might find in a store, even the color of butter. So here in the US, this has been an ubiquitous conversation. I've heard countless times, especially on places like TikTok, about the darker the yolk, the healthier or more free range a chicken is. The redder the salmon, the more wild the salmon is, or maybe even the color of the butter, the more nutritious it is. So the list can go on and on. This is actually mismarketing. So looking critically at the issue, what causes the pigment of these items? What do you kind of think? It's what the creature is eating. So just like us, what goes in affects what comes out. So on the right hand of my slide shows the color wheel that's actually given to large farms so they can choose what color they want their yolks to be in order to sell more to the consumer. If the farmer wants a darker yolk, they will provide the farmer with chicken feed with more carotenoids. These are naturally occurring molecules in plants such as marigolds, dandelions, other plants that chickens might find in the field that causes that pigment to become darker. Also, if you see down in the right-hand side below that, you'll see axanthin, and that's also a naturally occurring molecule that you'll find in algae that causes fish to carry that red color. So this can be an example of ecomedia literacy in the way of thinking and looking critically at what we are told and marketed to with the food industry. We can also think of this ecopedagogically. So who benefits from this? Who doesn't? And who might be harmed from this? So remember, next time you're picking your food, don't eye it before you buy it. Think critically before you buy it. I hope that was my 5 minutes. Thank you so much for my time here.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I really appreciate that. Okay, next up we have Sara Yasmin. I don't know if I'm saying your name, pronouncing it correctly. I'm in Italy, and so my pronunciation's been completely italicized, so my apologies. Diaz Montejano was raised and still lives in occupied Tongva lands and is the daughter of Salvadoran refugees. Before pursuing her graduate studies, Sarah taught for 6 years at Environmental Charter High School. Despite transitioning from the classroom, she still works at the ECHS as a social justice coach. Sarah is currently a doctoral candidate in urban schooling program at UCLA. Her research documents and examines how critical education learn and teach Indigenous lands and water education in their ethnic studies and environmental education classrooms to forge respectful and reciprocal relationships with local Indigenous communities. SADA recognizes or organizes with Los Angeles People's Education Movement chapter in community settings. Okay, Sada, you are on.
Thank you, Professor López. Hello, everyone. Hola a todos. You can go to the next slide. So what I'm sharing is just a unit of study that I'm collaborating with a teacher that I'm working with. I serve kind of as her instructional coach, but this is also part of my research study. So what I've been trying to do in my research is trying to figure out how do critical educators learn and implement Indigenous lands and waters pedagogies. And so right now I'm working with a teacher who teaches a 9th grade ethnic studies class. And what we've been trying to figure out is how do we take this class that is usually centered around humans, around social struggle, right? Social justice. And how do we also bring in environmental justice, since both are so intrinsically tied? And so we were tinkering or trying to play around with a unit on colonialism and settler colonialism. And so part of what we started to talk about was, well, How is colonialism still felt, and settler colonialism, how does it still, or how is it manifest, right, in our everyday lives? And so we wanted to do a unit around, or that kind of centered or brought into the conversation lands and waters. And what we didn't want to do is talk about it in the ways that it typically gets talked about, which is like, we all have a right to it. It's a resource, right? How can we kind of bring in more indigenous epistemologies into the conversation? And so what we came up with was this unit where we think about this kind of key idea that I think indigenous communities across the world oftentimes share, which is having this real relationship to lands and waters and seeing it as akin or as an entity unto itself, right? And so how does those ideas, how does it challenge us to maybe rethink our own relationship to land and water? And so the way that we thought about this unit was, let's start off with thinking about California and our own situation with land and water. And one of the biggest ones is our drought. And then having young people ask themselves, well, what relationship do I even have with water, right? If we keep talking about we have a crisis of water, what's our actual relationship to it? What is the relationship that our family or community has to it? And then moving into, well, what about the folks who have lived in this land since time immemorial, right? Both me and the teacher who teaches this class, she's Mexicana, I'm Salvadoreña. And so for us, we have arrived to these lands through displacement, no? And so our relationship to lands and waters is complicated. And usually it's disrupted, like we can't really articulate one. And so trying to bring in the voices and center the voices of indigenous folks who are local to here, so the Tongva and Paiute, and learning from them, what is the history of this place? What has water been like here? What is their current struggle with water, right? And what is, how can we think about our developing a relationship to water here and a relationship to indigenous communities here? And so then we decided to present 3 different case studies of folks fighting for water in Guatemala, Honduras, and in El Salvador. And the reason for that was because we wanted to talk about what is examples internationally of folks fighting for land and water, but also how are these other communities articulating a relationship to land and water that might be different from what we've heard from environmental communities here in the US. And then also, I think, in trying to figure out what's our own genealogical responsibility to fighting and defending water and land. And so our hope is to have young people kind of think about the fight for land and water as a way to disrupt colonialism and settler colonialism, right? How do we think about relationship as a disruptor, and how can it make us make better choices, not just for the land and the water, but also for all of the people who are connected to it, who have a responsibility to it and an accountability to it. And so our hope is to have young people create a TikTok series on Tongva histories connected to water, a case study that we've presented, and then a reflective piece where they start interrogating their own relationship to water and what they want, and land, and what they'd like it to be, considering how dire a situation we find ourselves in, right? And I think hopefully having a conversation about why it's necessary for us to really think about a reimagining of how we connect to water and to land, and how we hopefully see it as a way forward and a path away from what has always been presented to us, which is that colonialism and settler colonialism are inevitable and are the only ways to exist in this world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sada. It was wonderful. Okay, our last presenter is Amber Medina. She's in her 4th year as an educator in the greater Los Angeles region. She currently teaches 4th grade in an inner city public school where she integrates critical media literacy and environmental justice education into her core curriculum. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in environmental policy and planning, a master's degree in education from UCLA. She also works as a curriculum creator for the nonprofit Subject to Climate, designing lesson plans for climate action and environmental justice education. And I just want to make a plug for Subject to Climate. It's one of my favorite websites for lessons. And Amber is a prolific contributor from what I can see. So I'm very curious to learn more from Amber. So take it away, Amber.
Thank you so much. And so happy to hear Subject to Climate getting put on the map. I'm very excited about it. So yes, I have experience teaching 3rd and 4th grade as well as middle school. Also part of the same environmental charter family as Sada, who was just presenting earlier. In each of these classroom environments and experience, I have introduced the concept of critical media literacy and utilized it as a means to develop environmental consciousness in ways that are interdisciplinary and accessible to share with other teachers. I format my lessons using these 3 steps that were adopted by Subject to Climate, and that's inquire, investigate, and inspire, to create a flow of environmental discourse that is developmentally appropriate and also highly engaging for young students. These are 2 snapshot examples on the slide that is being presented right now of 2 different units that I have done in the classroom. So the ads on my left are a book that was pushed in schools by Republican lawmakers in Oklahoma, Petropete's Big Bad Dream, and a commercial by ExxonMobil that is promoting a petro-positive message out to 2 different audiences. So with my students, we looked at the 2 different audiences that these were catered to and investigated the messages that were present and missing from the commercial. And afterwards, we researched petroleum extraction and the messages and truths that were not displayed by these advertisements. As their culminating project, we listed all of the items in the 2 ads that suggested wouldn't be possible without petroleum. And in groups, students found sustainable alternatives that created those same products without the use of petroleum. So in the end, they created their own advertisement to challenge a narrative in those first 2 ads that we investigated together. Another concept we explored in the classroom was transportation modes. We looked at the ecological footprints of different modes of transportation, reflected on our own ecological footprint, and then explored how transportation modes are presented in the media. Being from Los Angeles, a predominantly automobile-centered community, we investigated the causes of resident choices and dove deeper into the why behind our low ridership and our use of public transportation in comparison to other urban areas in the world. They used what they learned to reimagine the different modes of transportation and created media to promote their reimagined systems. So ultimately, my goal in the classroom is to have students build global awareness, critical thinking, and because in the state of California, environmental education standards are still not required and teachers are not trained in this practice, I hope that students can build a critical understanding of the natural world and cultivate an eco-media literacy lens. And both of these units are actually available and accessible on Subject to Climate as well. So I've published it through them and it's 100% free. There's slideshows, lesson plans, student worksheets, handouts. So it's a beautiful resource, and I'm very grateful that I'm allowed to create and push it out because a lot of teachers have time crunches, they have deadlines, they have testing, they have all of these other standards that they have to hit. And so making all of this content and utilizing ecomedia literacy in a way that is interdisciplinary with ELA, with math, with social studies, with social justice, restorative practices, just makes it a big reminder to everyone, teachers, staff, non-teachers, students, that this is our livelihood. This is a part of us, and that the natural world is a part of who we are. And I wasn't time myself, but that's it.
Okay, Amber, actually, you're right on time. Thank you so much. And I definitely want to talk to you at some point, because I wanted to take a chance to just quickly plug a website that I've been working on called ecomedialiteracy.org, which is specifically a place to find lessons for media educators to bring green topics, sustainability topics, environmental topics into their classrooms. And so I'm just launching it this week in honor of Media Literacy Week. It's finally working, and I'm also soliciting people to submit lessons to build out the database. So I encourage anyone who was part of this panel to please share with me whatever lessons you have so I can put them on the site. And also anyone out there who's in the audience who would like to contribute, I highly encourage you to do that. It's going to be a collective process in order to make this happen. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of this slideshow. And I want to thank all the panelists for your wonderful presentations. And we're able to spend about, looks like 15 minutes at least to talk about, to ask questions, to have a discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to anyone who would like to offer a comment or a question. The floor is yours. Or perhaps there's someone who wants to, one of our panelists who may have seen a connection between their own work and someone else's presentation. You're also welcome to, if you're shy, to type a question in the chat.
Maybe just to get things going, I'd love to ask a little bit, it sounds like there are a lot of lines running through everything. And Sada, when you talked about kind of the importance of the indigenous perspective, it really made me think about the power, we talk about media, of language, and language as a medium of communication, and how for many indigenous cultures, the language carries a whole cosmovision and worldview that is such an important part of our relationship with nature. I'm curious about anybody who wants to share thoughts about that.
Maybe as a follow-up, Sada, since you were doing a cross-cultural comparison of perceptions or worldviews of water, are there different words that carry different meanings with the different cultures you were exploring?
I feel like depending on context, people have different like words and different ways of articulating their relationship. So for like folks in Guatemala, the folks who are living and trying to defend Lago Atitlan, like for them, they talk about the lake as their grandmother, right? And that's very different from the folks who are organizing in El Salvador, who don't necessarily identify as indigenous, right? Back in the 1930s, the Salvadoran government did all they could to try to kill as many indigenous peoples as they could, and then to criminalize anything connected to indigeneity or languages. And so we only have like one recognized tribe in El Salvador. And so I think like what the hope is that young people are able to look at how folks are articulating water and be able to compare it, right? And not necessarily to say like which one is better, and also not to like co-opt the way that indigenous communities are talking about their relationship to land, but rather to be inspired by how folks talk about land and water in a way that is so fundamentally different from the way that we talk about it in the US, in in the empires, right? Like how can we take a look at these communities that have been able to survive, and that continue to not just defend themselves, but defend the land and the water, and how can we learn from them to be able to do the same, and figure out, especially for those of us whose relationship to land and water have been so destroyed, how do we start to think about it as a real possibility for ourselves? And how do we start thinking of practices that we can engage in that connect us to it, right? I think like I had never really considered what it would mean to have water and land be my kin. And I think like when I think about that, I feel like my own community becomes so much more expansive, right? And possibilities become more like endless.
You know, Sara, I think one thing you're saying makes me think about how at the very beginning I talked about an expanded concept of media. There is a whole aspect of ecomedia studies that talks about elements as a medium, you know, like water as a medium, and, you know, various different ice as a medium of storing sort of historical memory of the atmosphere, things like that. And I've been very interested in thinking through media literacy and media through the lens of water. So, for example, in Rachel's discussion of AI, you know, water is a big factor in AI because a lot of these server farms that are powering the data require water for cooling. And because of the drought that's been, you know, various different regions of the US, and not just the US, but other parts of the world, at one point they had to shut down some servers in California because there just wasn't enough water to cool them. And then also thinking about water is a medium now of microplastics, which is not a very pleasant thought, but this is precisely what's happening everywhere in the world now. They're finding microplastics in rainwater, sadly. Another thought I had, and anyone can jump in at any point that you want, but I was thinking, since many of you are in Los Angeles and I'm from LA, so I feel a particular kinship with all of you from there, and also from my compadres from Latin America. So a few years ago, I did the drive from LA to Sequoia National Park, and it was really interesting going through after having done a lot of studying of sustainability and environmental studies and so forth, and going through the Central Valley and thinking of the landscape as pedagogical. And, you know, the way that you're in the middle of the desert, and, you know, there's all these orange trees that really probably shouldn't be there. And the whole landscape has been transformed to channel water into these grids to supply, you know, for these oranges that will be, I don't know what they're used for, orange juice, and they're exported all over the world. And then all of a sudden you come across all these oil fields in the middle of all that. And then I start thinking, and fracking, you know, I'm thinking like, well, what is the waste from these oil? How's that entering into the water supply and then entering into the food system? And so it's like this very, like this desert landscape through this, what Vandana Shiva talks about, like the monoculture of the mind, imagines this whole landscape as a monoculture for industrial production, for not only industrial production of food, but industrial production. This is tied also to Michaela's talk, very much connected. It's the same worldview. It's this monoculture of the mind. And then to go up to Sequoia, and once you're in that national park, it's like there's all these signs about how important it is to conserve and to be careful and to don't do this, don't touch that, and, you know, beware of the bears. You know, it's just like you're entering into another worldview, which is more like, I would say, you know, a conservationist worldview. Absent in this single drive that I'm talking about is the indigenous perspective, because that memory has mostly been wiped out, but I'm sure it persists in pockets in different places. But anyways, that was just all of your talks sort of, there seemed to be some overlapping elements of these different worldviews as sort of ways of constructing the world and building the world as forms of world building, actually. I don't know if that resonates with any of you in the way you're thinking about your topics.
Definitely. I wanted to say the microplastics in the water also go into the fish, and then we eat the fish. So that's another way that foodways are kind of disrupted. And also in that orange grove, the bees that pollinate the orange grove have to be shipped from different places. So there are stories of people from Florida shipping their bees to the almond grove, specifically in California, then having them stolen. So there's a lot and of course the honey being adulterated now also. So they cut honey with different sugars and syrups to sell on the market. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with monocultures elsewhere too.
And actually, Michaela, since I totally forgot about almonds, which a lot are being used for almond milk, which is often sold as like a vegetarian alternative. But from what I understand, almond milk is really not great for the environment.
Not great. Also,
Yeah.
it takes a lot of water, which is what we were talking about too.
And incidentally, you know, the ultimate modern medium really it's plastic. And petrochemical plastic in particular. And in that realm of ecomedia studies that I was talking about, there is sort of a branch that's interested in plastic as a medium also. Okay, we have a question here. In Tierra de Fuego, we do have introduced species of animals like Canadian beavers. The excuse was just to make our land more beautiful. Then when you think more about it, you realize that it was for promoting hunting and ruining ecosystems. Yes, that's a sad story. And in fact, I'll share another sort of related story, because one of the ways I got into ecomedia literacy was because I was working with Native American youth doing video production when I lived in New Mexico. And one of the projects we worked on was documenting invasive species that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had brought into the river system, like salt cedars and different types and Russian olives, to control flooding. But then now those trees are very water intensive and they're extracting too much water. And so a lot of different indigenous groups are trying to remove these invasive species. And I worked at the Santa Fe Indian School, and my colleague, one of my colleagues who I worked with on this project, who's also a white settler historically, such as myself, we talked about ourselves as invasive species, you know, so like, just like the beavers in a way, you know, the colonialism is an example of invasive species, so to speak. Okay, we still have a few more minutes. Anyone else want to jump in or have a question or a comment?
Well, I'll just jump back. Jeff, I think I heard your initial question was about the use of language and language as medium for communication. And one of the things I do in my Ecomedia Literacy class, which is a 200 level, and it's a general education class. So it's open to students across our university. And it's cross-listed with environmental studies. So I have a number of students coming from the sciences to take that class. But one of the things I do in that class is I share with them an article about the ways in which the English language is divorced from environment. And it becomes this really sort of, light bulb moment for the students where they say, wait a second, what kind of pronouns are we using to talk about environmental things? Everything becomes it, which, as was sort of mentioned earlier in Sarah's presentation, sort of separates in many ways and creates that hierarchy of humans of something of value, but not in relationship with everything else. Everything else is stagnant, is everything else is product, not living in part of a system in relation with each other. And so I just want to acknowledge that while it might seem small, is also incredibly transformative for many of my students, where they recognize, hang on, the words I use do have meaning, and they are invisibly shaping my environmental worldview.
Okay, Rachel, that was a great way to close the session. I thought that was an excellent comment. Thank you. So according to our guidelines, we've reached the point where I should be thanking everybody. I particularly wanted to thank Catalina Rojas and Soledad López for being our interpreters. Thank you so much. I know this is hard work and exhausting, and you deserve our praise. I want to thank Jeff for ultimately organizing us and putting us together, and Andrea Gambino, who's also involved in it. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting, if I miss someone, I apologize. But and I just want to thank also the panelists. I learned a lot from all of you, and I really, really hope that you will continue this discussion and also reach out to me, and I'll reach out to you to get some of your lessons up on the website and to help spread the word. And we can learn about we can spread the concepts of ecomedia literacy to the rest of the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. This was wonderful. One last thing, if anybody wants to drop any links or suggestions, any websites or anything they'd like to share, please feel free to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you.
I'm going to put in the link to the Ecomedia Literacy website.
Right.